The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over Palmetto Springs, Florida, on March 15, 2024, as Detective Rachel Morrison walked into the police station with a manila folder clutched against her chest. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the oppressive heat that made the asphalt shimmer like water, but from the weight of what she carried. Inside that folder was the answer to a question that had haunted a small Gulf Coast community for 32 years. The answer that would shatter everything people thought they knew about trust, friendship, and the quiet neighbor who had lived among them all this time. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, we must travel back 3 decades to a different Florida, a different time, when the world moved slower and secrets could hide in plain sight for a lifetime. It was April 9, 1992, when 23-year-old Jennifer Hastings vanished from the face of the earth. The spring evening had started like any other in Palmetto Springs, a coastal town of 8,000 souls nestled between the Gulf of Mexico and endless stretches of pine forest. Jennifer, a bright-eyed graduate student studying marine biology at the University of South Florida, had told her roommate she was going to the Palmetto Springs Library to return some books before it closed at 8. She left their small apartment on Cypress Avenue at 7:15, her arms full of textbooks about coral reef ecosystems, her red Honda Civic parked in its usual spot outside. The week leading up to that fateful evening had been particularly busy for Jennifer. She had just submitted her thesis proposal on coral bleaching and climate change, a project that excited her professors and positioned her as a rising star in her field. On Monday, she had presented her research at a departmental seminar, speaking passionately about the urgent need to protect Florida's reef systems. On Wednesday, she had volunteered at the Clearwater Marine Aquarium, where she helped educate visiting school children about marine conservation. She had called her parents on Tuesday evening, her voice bright with enthusiasm, as she described her latest findings and her plans for summer fieldwork in the Keys. Those who knew Jennifer during that last week would later tell investigators that she seemed happier than ever, full of plans and dreams. She had mentioned to Patricia Chen that she was thinking about adopting a rescue dog after graduation. She had circled apartments in Tampa she wanted to visit, preparing for her move closer to the university's main campus. She had marked her calendar for her mother's birthday party the following weekend, already planning the surprise she would bring. Every detail of her life pointed toward a future she was eager to embrace. She never made it to the library, she never came home, and for 3 decades, no one knew what happened in those missing hours. Jennifer's roommate, Patricia Chen, didn't think much of it when Jennifer didn't return that night. Jennifer sometimes stayed late at the Marine Research Facility or grabbed dinner with classmates. But when morning came and Jennifer's bed remained untouched, when her car sat unmoved in the parking lot with her books still stacked on the passenger seat, Patricia's concern turned to alarm. She called Jennifer's parents in Tampa. They called the police. Within hours, Palmetto Springs mobilized. This was a town where everyone knew everyone, where people left their doors unlocked and children played outside until the streetlights came on. The disappearance of a young woman, especially someone as beloved as Jennifer Hastings, sent shockwaves through every home, every business, every church on every corner. Volunteers formed search parties that combed through the pine forest. Local fishermen took their boats out to scan the coastline. The police interviewed everyone who might have seen Jennifer that evening. The library was only a 12-minute walk from her apartment. Between Point A and Point B lay 4 blocks of residential streets lined with live oaks draped in Spanish moss, modest homes with screened porches, and the kind of stillness that made Palmetto Springs feel like a refuge from the chaos of larger cities. Someone must have seen something. Someone must have heard something. But as the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, the trail grew colder than the Gulf waters in January. Detective Thomas Brennan, the lead investigator in 1992, was a methodical man in his 50s who had spent his entire career in Palmetto Springs. He interviewed more than 200 people. He studied Jennifer's life for any hint of trouble, any suggestion that she might have wanted to disappear. What he found was a young woman with everything to live for. Jennifer's professors described her as passionate and dedicated. Her friends painted a picture of someone who loved her family, who dreamed of protecting endangered marine species, who volunteered at the local aquarium on weekends. There were no mysterious boyfriends, no drug connections, no debts, no enemies. Jennifer Hastings was, by all accounts, the kind of person who made the world better simply by being in it. The investigation followed every possible avenue, including several that seemed promising but ultimately led nowhere. A gas station attendant reported seeing a young woman matching Jennifer's description getting into a vehicle with out-of-state plates around 8:30 that evening, but the timing didn't align with when Jennifer left her apartment. A fisherman claimed he saw someone who might have been Jennifer walking along the beach near midnight, but when pressed for details, his story fell apart under scrutiny. Anonymous tips flooded the police station in those first weeks, each one investigated, each one cataloged, each one failing to provide the breakthrough Brennan desperately sought. Brennan also explored darker possibilities that the family found painful but necessary. He investigated whether Jennifer might have been involved with anyone who could have wished her harm. He checked for any signs of stalking or harassment in the weeks before her disappearance. He interviewed every male student and professor she had regular contact with, looking for anything unusual, any red flags, any hint of obsession or animosity. The library staff were questioned about whether anyone had asked about Jennifer's habits or schedule. Her neighbors were asked if they had noticed anyone watching the apartment building. Every stone was turned, every shadow examined, but the light revealed nothing but more questions. But Brennan also discovered something else. Several witnesses reported seeing a dark blue or black pickup truck driving slowly through Jennifer's neighborhood that evening. One elderly resident, Harold Kimball, told police he had been sitting on his porch on Oak Street, 2 blocks from Jennifer's apartment, when he noticed the truck pass by 3 times between 7 and 8 that night. It struck him as odd because he didn't recognize the vehicle, and in a town like Palmetto Springs, you noticed unfamiliar cars. The driver, he said, appeared to be alone, but the tinted windows and fading light made it impossible to see clearly. Police put out appeals for information about the truck. They checked registrations throughout the county. They followed dozens of leads that went nowhere. As spring turned to summer and summer to fall, the case began to fade from the daily news. By 1993, Jennifer's face appeared less frequently in the papers. By 1995, Detective Brennan retired, the case still unsolved, the mystery still intact. And by the time the new millennium arrived, Jennifer Hastings had become another name in a file cabinet, another tragedy whispered about on quiet nights, another family left without answers. But the years didn't erase Jennifer's presence from Palmetto Springs. Her disappearance changed the town in subtle but lasting ways. Parents who had once let their teenagers walk freely after dark began driving them everywhere. The sense of safety that had defined small-town life evaporated, replaced by locked doors and watchful eyes. Every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, the local newspaper ran a story, keeping her memory alive, asking anyone with information to come forward. The library where she never arrived placed a small plaque in her honor, a reminder that some journeys end before they should. The case became part of the town's collective consciousness, a wound that never fully healed. When young women went missing in nearby counties, people wondered if there was a connection. When unidentified remains were discovered anywhere in central Florida, the Hastings family held their breath, hoping for closure but dreading confirmation. The uncertainty was its own kind of torture, leaving them trapped in a perpetual present where their daughter was neither fully gone nor able to come home. Jennifer's parents, Robert and Diane Hastings, never stopped searching. They kept her room exactly as she left it. They placed advertisements in newspapers every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. They worked with organizations that helped families of missing persons. Robert, a high school history teacher, spent countless hours in libraries and courthouses teaching himself about investigative techniques, about forensic science, about the slow machinery of justice. Diane, a nurse, channeled her grief into advocacy, speaking at events about missing persons cases, about the importance of never giving up hope. They refused to accept that their daughter had simply vanished, that there would never be answers, never be closure. And then, in 2007, 15 years after Jennifer disappeared, a development that seemed like it might finally crack the case wide open. A construction crew breaking ground for a new shopping center on the outskirts of Palmetto Springs made a grim discovery. Buried in a shallow grave beneath 4 feet of sandy soil, they found human remains. The news electrified the community and devastated the Hastings family. Could this finally be Jennifer? The remains were sent for analysis. Weeks of agonizing waiting followed. but the results brought confusion rather than clarity. The bones belonged to a young female, approximately the right age, but dental records didn't match. DNA testing, still relatively new and limited in 2007, proved inconclusive due to the degradation of the remains. The clothing found with the body didn't match anything Jennifer had been known to wear. This was someone else's daughter, someone else's tragedy. The case sparked a new investigation into missing persons throughout Central Florida, but Jennifer's whereabouts remained as mysterious as ever. Detective Rachel Morrison first encountered the Hastings case in 2018 when she transferred to Palmetto Springs from Miami. She was 34 years old, relatively young for a detective, but she had earned her reputation working complex cases in a much larger department. She had grown up in a small town not unlike Palmetto Springs, and when an opportunity arose to escape the intensity of Miami and return to a quieter pace of life, she took it. She didn't expect Palmetto Springs to be quiet in the ways that mattered. Within her first week, Morrison found herself drawn to the cold case files stored in the basement of the station. There were 17 unsolved cases dating back to the 1970s, but one immediately captured her attention: Jennifer Hastings. Something about the case bothered Morrison. The complete absence of evidence, the seemingly impossible disappearance, the truck that multiple witnesses mentioned, but that had never been identified. It felt less like a case that had gone cold and more like a case that had never been properly warmed to begin with. Morrison began to rebuild the investigation from scratch. She tracked down original witnesses, many of them now elderly or scattered across the country. She digitized every document, every photograph, every scrap of paper related to the case. She studied maps of Palmetto Springs as it existed in 1992, noting which buildings had been demolished, which roads had been expanded, which empty lots had become strip malls and housing developments. She immersed herself in Jennifer's world, reading her letters, her school papers, trying to understand not just what happened, but why. And she kept coming back to the truck. That dark blue or black pickup that Harold Kimball had seen circling the neighborhood. Kimball had passed away in 2012, but his original statement remained clear and detailed. He had been certain about what he saw. Morrison obtained vehicle registration records from Pinellas County for every pickup truck that matched the description in 1992. There were hundreds. She cross-referenced them with residents of Palmetto Springs in the surrounding area. Still hundreds. She needed something more. In 2020, the world changed. The pandemic forced people indoors, shifted priorities, remade daily life in ways large and small. For Morrison, it meant more time with the old files, more late nights at the station when the building was empty and quiet. It meant thinking about Jennifer Hastings while the rest of the world worried about the present and future. And it meant being at her desk on a gray October afternoon when she received a call that would eventually change everything. The caller was a woman named Margaret Donnelly, 78 years old, calling from an assisted living facility in Clearwater. She had seen a story about unsolved cases in Pinellas County on the local news, and Jennifer's face had looked familiar. Margaret explained that in the spring of 1992, she had been living on Oak Street in Palmetto Springs. She remembered hearing about Jennifer's disappearance, and she remembered something else, something she had never told police because, at the time, it seemed insignificant, maybe even foolish. Around that same time period, maybe a week or two before Jennifer vanished, Margaret had been walking her dog early one morning when she noticed something strange. There was a dark truck parked on the street near the corner, and a man was sitting in the driver's seat, just watching the neighborhood. He wasn't reading a newspaper or eating breakfast or doing anything that would explain why he was there, just watching. She caught his eye for a moment before he started the engine and drove away. The truck had a distinctive feature that stuck in her memory all these years later: a large dent in the rear passenger side panel, as if someone had backed into a pole. Morrison felt electricity run through her, a detail, a specific, verifiable detail that hadn't been in any of the original reports. She pressed Margaret for more information. Did she remember what the man looked like? Margaret's memory was hazy after so many years, but she thought he was white, maybe in his 30s or 40s, with light-colored hair, average build. Nothing that stood out except the intensity of his gaze and the dent in that truck. It wasn't much, but it was something. Morrison returned to the vehicle registration records with renewed focus. She began calling owners of dark pickup trucks from 1992, asking if they remembered having body damage around that time. Most of the numbers were disconnected. Many owners had moved, passed away, or sold their vehicles decades ago. But Morrison was patient. This was how cold cases were solved. One phone call at a time, one detail at a time, one small connection that led to another. Then came the breakthrough that changed everything. In March of 2021, a new forensic technology became available to law enforcement agencies in Florida. It was called forensic genetic genealogy, and it had already solved several cold cases around the country by using DNA evidence to build family trees and identify suspects through their relatives. Morrison immediately thought of the 1992 evidence. There had been minimal physical evidence collected, but there was one item that had always puzzled investigators: a cigarette butt found on Oak Street, about a block from Jennifer's apartment, on the evening she disappeared. The butt had been photographed and cataloged, but deemed too common to be significant. In those days, smoking was ubiquitous, and a discarded cigarette on a public street meant nothing. But it had been preserved in the evidence room all these years. Morrison submitted it for advanced DNA analysis and genealogical research. The process was complex and painstaking. First, forensic scientists extracted what little DNA remained from the cigarette, degraded by 3 decades of storage, but still viable thanks to careful preservation. They created a genetic profile and uploaded it to genealogical databases where millions of people had voluntarily submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry. The technology didn't identify the smoker directly, but it found relatives, distant cousins, who shared portions of DNA with the unknown individual. From there, genetic genealogists worked backward, building family trees, identifying common ancestors, mapping out branches of families across generations. They cross-referenced public records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries. They traced lineages through census data and historical documents. It was detective work of a different kind, combining cutting-edge science with old-fashioned genealogical research. The process took months, requiring patience and precision, following genetic breadcrumbs across decades and generations. Months passed. The technology was cutting-edge but slow, and there was a backlog of cases across the state. Morrison continued her traditional investigation, interviewing old witnesses, searching for the dented truck, building timelines. She visited Robert and Diane Hastings regularly, keeping them informed of every development, careful not to raise false hope, but unable to hide her own growing conviction that this case could finally be solved. In September of 2023, the results came back. The DNA from the cigarette had been successfully profiled and run through genealogical databases. The analysts had built a family tree and narrowed down potential matches to a handful of individuals. One name emerged as the most likely candidate: Vincent Porter. Morrison stared at the name on her computer screen, her heart pounding. Vincent Porter. The name meant nothing to her. She ran it through every database available. What she found made her blood run cold. Vincent Porter was 68 years old. He had lived in Palmetto Springs since 1985. He had worked as a maintenance supervisor for the County Parks Department from 1988 until his retirement in 2015. He had a wife, 3 children, and 5 grandchildren. He coached Little League Baseball for 15 years. He volunteered at the local food bank. He sang in the church choir. His home was a modest ranch house on Maple Drive, less than a mile from where Jennifer Hastings had lived in 1992. He drove a dark blue Chevrolet pickup truck in 1992, according to old vehicle registration records, the same truck he had owned for decades before finally trading it in for a newer model in 2005. Vincent Porter was, by all outward appearances, the kind of person people described as a pillar of the community. When Morrison showed his photograph to elderly residents who had been in Palmetto Springs in the 90s, several recognized him immediately. The nice man who organized neighborhood cleanups, the helpful guy who fixed things for people, the friendly neighbor everyone waved to. But DNA doesn't lie. And when Morrison obtained a court order for a fresh DNA sample from Vincent Porter and compared it to the cigarette butt, the match was conclusive. The man who had stood on Oak Street smoking a cigarette on April 9, 1992, was Vincent Porter. Morrison knew she needed more than his presence in the neighborhood that night. Defense attorneys would argue that smoking on a public street wasn't a crime, that Porter could have been out for a walk or visiting a friend. She needed to connect every dot. She needed to understand the why as well as the who. She returned to Margaret Donnelly's statement about the dented truck and the watching man. She obtained search warrants for Porter's property records, his employment history, his financial documents from 1992. And in a storage unit Porter had rented continuously since 1994, investigators found a locked metal box containing photographs, not the family photos you might expect. These were surveillance photos taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, photos of young women going about their daily lives unaware they were being watched. And among those photographs were 3 pictures of Jennifer Hastings walking near her apartment, taken in the weeks before she disappeared. The discovery opened a terrifying window into Vincent Porter's secret life. Further investigation revealed that he had a juvenile record that had been sealed when he turned 18, involving inappropriate behavior toward a teenage girl in another county. His military service record showed a pattern of disciplinary issues. Former co-workers, when pressed, recalled uncomfortable incidents they had dismissed or forgotten, moments when Porter's attention to young female employees seemed excessive, times when his helpfulness crossed into something less innocent. Confronted with the evidence, Vincent Porter's facade crumbled. In his first interview with Morrison, he maintained his innocence, claiming he didn't remember Jennifer, couldn't explain the photographs, suggested the DNA evidence must be contaminated. But as the interrogation continued, as Morrison methodically presented each piece of evidence, as the walls closed in, something shifted in Porter's demeanor. The friendly neighbor disappeared. What remained was someone Morrison barely recognized as human. He confessed in the early hours of a cold morning in January 2024. Jennifer had been a random target, he said, someone whose routine he had observed, whose vulnerability he had identified. On that April evening in 1992, he had been driving through the neighborhood in his truck when he saw her walking alone. He offered her a ride, claiming his wife was friends with her mother and he'd been asked to check on her. Trusting and kind, Jennifer accepted. Instead of taking her to the library, he drove her to a remote area of the Pine Forest Reserve, where he took her life and buried her body in a location he claimed he could no longer remember. The forest had changed too much in 32 years, he said. New trails, new growth, new developments. She was lost to the earth now, part of the landscape. Even in confession, Vincent Porter showed no real remorse. He spoke about Jennifer as if she had been an object rather than a person, as if her dreams and hopes and the people who loved her meant nothing. When Morrison asked him why Jennifer? Why that night? Why any of it? He shrugged. Because he could, he said. Because he wanted to. Because in that moment he had the power and she didn't. The arrest of Vincent Porter on March 14, 2024, sent shockwaves through Palmetto Springs that rivaled the original disappearance. The man who had lived among them for decades, who had taught their children to hit baseballs and volunteered at community events, was accused of one of the most heinous acts imaginable. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the monster in handcuffs with the man they thought they knew. His wife filed for divorce within days. His children refused to speak to him. The community that had embraced him felt violated and betrayed in ways that would take years to heal. For Robert and Diane Hastings, now in their 70s, the arrest brought a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that they finally had answers. Grief that those answers confirmed their worst fears. Anger that the person responsible had lived freely for 3 decades while they suffered, and profound sadness that after all these years they still didn't know where their daughter's remains lay, still couldn't bring her home for a proper burial. Detective Morrison led a massive search of the Pine Forest Reserve using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and teams of volunteers. They searched for months, but the forest had indeed changed dramatically since 1992. Controlled burns, hurricanes, development, and 3 decades of natural growth had transformed the landscape. If Jennifer was there, the earth was keeping her secret. The trial began in September of 2024. Vincent Porter pleaded not guilty despite his confession, which his attorneys attempted to have suppressed on technical grounds. For 3 weeks, the community watched as prosecutors presented their case, the DNA evidence, the photographs, the testimony of experts and witnesses, the confession tape that made even hardened court reporters look away. Throughout it all, Porter sat expressionless, occasionally whispering to his lawyers, but never showing emotion. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Vincent Porter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die behind bars, just as Jennifer Hastings had died alone in the forest, her final moments erased from history, except in the memory of her attacker. But the story doesn't end in a courtroom. The resolution of Jennifer's case had ripples that extended far beyond Palmetto Springs. Detective Morrison's use of forensic genetic genealogy helped establish protocols that would be adopted by cold case units throughout Florida. The publicity surrounding the case led to new tips in other unsolved disappearances from the 90s, some of which investigators are still actively pursuing. Porter's confession, despite his refusal to provide specific details about Jennifer's burial location, contained references to the area that might, investigators hope, eventually lead them to her. More importantly, Jennifer's story became a catalyst for change. Robert and Diane Hastings established a foundation in their daughter's name, dedicated to funding DNA analysis for unsolved cases and supporting families of missing persons. They worked with legislators to pass a law requiring better preservation of evidence in missing persons cases and mandating regular reviews of cold cases using new technologies. They transformed their grief into action, ensuring that their daughter's legacy would be helping others find the answers they sought for so many years. On a warm afternoon in April 2025, exactly 33 years after Jennifer disappeared, more than 500 people gathered at Palmetto Springs Community Park for a memorial service. There was no grave to visit, no headstone to mark, but the community came together to honor Jennifer's memory and to commit to never forgetting. Her former professors spoke about her passion for marine biology. Childhood friends shared stories that made people laugh and cry. Robert Hastings, his voice steady despite his tears, thanked Detective Morrison and everyone who had never given up on finding the truth. And Detective Rachel Morrison, standing at the edge of the crowd, thought about the thin line between justice and closure, between answers and peace. She had solved the case, had brought Vincent Porter to justice, had given the Hastings family the truth they deserved, but she couldn't give them back their daughter. She couldn't erase 32 years of anguish. She couldn't make the pain go away. What she could do, what she had done, was prove that even after decades, even when cases grow cold and memories fade and evidence degrades, the truth can still emerge. Evil can hide for a long time, but it cannot hide forever. The cigarette butt, carelessly discarded on a street corner in 1992, became the thread that unraveled everything, the tiny piece of evidence that waited patiently in a box for technology to catch up to truth. The case taught investigators that preservation matters, that seemingly insignificant evidence can become crucial with new techniques, that persistence pays dividends measured in decades. It taught communities that trust must be balanced with vigilance, that the familiar face can hide unfamiliar darkness, that we must look out for one another because predators rely on our complacency. It taught families never to give up hope, even when hope seems foolish, even when the world tells you to move on, even when the years pile up like leaves in autumn. Jennifer Hastings never got to complete her doctorate, never got to save endangered coral reefs, never got to fall in love or raise children or grow old watching sunsets over the Gulf of Mexico. Vincent Porter stole all of that from her, stole it from her family, stole it from a world that needed people like Jennifer more than it knew, but he couldn't steal her memory. He couldn't erase the impact she had on everyone who knew her, and he couldn't prevent the truth from eventually emerging, no matter how deeply he buried it. Today, Jennifer's photograph hangs in the cold case unit at Palmetto Springs Police Department, not as a victim, but as a reminder that every case deserves attention, every family deserves answers, every life matters enough to fight for justice, no matter how long it takes. Detective Morrison sees it every morning when she arrives at work, and every morning she thinks about the other files in the basement, the other families waiting for closure, the other secrets hiding in plain sight. Because the resolution of Jennifer Hastings' case proved something important, it's never too late. Technology advances. Witnesses come forward. Evidence waits patiently for its moment. And sometimes, when everything aligns, when dedication meets opportunity, when the past refuses to stay buried, the truth emerges like sunrise over the gulf, illuminating shadows that darkness thought it owned forever. The people of Palmetto Springs are different now, changed by the revelation that evil had walked among them, wearing a friendly face for so many years. They lock their doors. They watch their children more carefully. They question their assumptions about who can be trusted. Some might see this as tragedy compounding tragedy, but others understand it as wisdom earned the hard way, because the greatest danger isn't the monster in the shadows. It's the monster who waves hello every morning, who helps carry your groceries, who looks exactly like everyone else. And if there is a lesson in all of this, if there is something of value to take from Jennifer's story, it is this: we must never stop asking questions, never stop seeking truth, never stop fighting for justice, even when the fight seems impossible. We must honor the missing by refusing to forget them. We must support the families by standing with them through the long years of uncertainty. We must trust the process of investigation while also pushing for better tools, better techniques, better ways of preserving evidence and solving crimes. Most of all, we must remember that behind every cold case is a person who laughed and dreamed and loved, a family that still sets a place at the table, a hole in the world that can never quite be filled. Jennifer Hastings was more than a case number. She was a daughter, a student, a friend, a woman with her whole life ahead of her. And while Vincent Porter took her future, he couldn't take her past. That belongs to everyone who knew her, everyone who loved her, everyone who refused to let her be forgotten. On quiet evenings in Palmetto Springs, when the sun sets over the Gulf and the Spanish moss sways in the breeze, people sometimes think about Jennifer walking to the library on a spring night in 1992, her arms full of books about saving the ocean. They think about the moment her life changed forever, the instant when a trusted face became a nightmare. And they think about Detective Morrison, working late into the night, refusing to give up, following a 32-year-old trail until it led to truth. The arrest shocked the community because it shattered their illusions about safety and trust. But the resolution, painful as it was, also proved that persistence matters, that justice delayed is not always justice denied, that the arc of investigation can bend toward truth, even when it takes 3 decades to complete the circle. Jennifer Hastings may never come home. Her remains may stay hidden in the Pine Forest Reserve forever, part of the landscape she loved to study. But her case is closed. Her family has answers. Her attacker will spend the rest of his life paying for what he did. And every detective who works a cold case, every family waiting for news, every person who wonders if the truth will ever emerge can look at Jennifer's story and know that it's possible. It's always possible. You just have to never, ever give up.